fuck, Andy. You are crazy. Hey, people, we're reading about propaganda again. Amazing. Alienation through propaganda. Oh, how apropos. To be alienated means to be someone other than oneself. It also can mean to belong to someone else. In a more profound sense, it means to be deprived of one's self, to be subjected to, or even identified with someone else. That is definitely the effect of propaganda. There's a footnote. Consider the role assigned by Communist Party to propaganda. It must change the very conscience of the Soviet citizen, and we find the same idea in Mao. Propaganda strips the individual, robs him of part of himself, and makes him live an alien and artificial life. To such an extent, he becomes another person and obeys impulses foreign to him. He obeys someone else. But as we have often recalled, the persons subjected to propaganda do not consider themselves influenced by it. Each thinks that he himself has found the road to truth. Once again, to produce this effect, propaganda restricts itself to utilizing, increasing, and reinforcing the individual's inclination to lose himself in something bigger than he is, to dissipate his individuality, to free his ego of all doubt, conflict, and suffering through fusion with others, to devote himself to a great leader and a great cause. In large groups, man feels united with others, and he therefore tries to free himself of himself by blending with a large group. Indeed, propaganda offers him that possibility in an exceptionally easy and satisfying fashion, but it pushes the individual into the mass until he disappears entirely. To begin with, what is it that propaganda makes disappear? I should turn off my AC. Sake of the fucking video that no one will watch, because for some reason I know everything about propaganda. I don't need to read P. Mars's book about it. I already know it doesn't affect me. I'm smarter than it. To begin with, what is it that propaganda makes disappear? Everything in the nature of critical and personal judgment. Okay, to begin with, what is it that propaganda makes disappear? Everything in the nature of critical and personal judgment. Obviously, propaganda limits the application of thought. It limits the propagandee's field of thought to the extent that it provides him with ready-made and moreover unreal thoughts and stereotypes. It orients him toward very limited ends and prevents him from using his mind or experimenting on his own. It determines the core from which all his thoughts must derive and draws from the beginning a sort of guideline that permits neither criticism nor imagination. More precisely, his imagination will lead only to small digressions from the fixed line and to only slightly deviant preliminary responses within the framework. In this fashion, we see the progressives make some variations around the basic propaganda tenets of the Communist Party, but the field of such variation is strictly limited. The acceptance of this line, of such ends and limitations, presupposes the suppression of all critical judgment, which in turn is a result of the crystallization of thoughts and attitudes and the creation of taboos. As Jules Monarot has actually accurately said, all individual passion leads to the suppression of all critical judgment with regard to the object of that passion. Beyond that, in the collective passion created by propaganda, critical judgment disappears altogether, for in no way can there ever be collective critical judgment. Man becomes incapable of separation of discernment. The word critical is derived from the Greek krino, separate. The individual can no longer judge for himself because he inescapably relates his thoughts to the entire complex of values and prejudices established by propaganda. With regard to political situations, he is given ready-made value judgments invested with the power of truth by the number of supporters and the word of experts. The individual has no chance to exercise his judgment either on principal questions or on their implication. This leads to atrophy of a faculty not comfortably exercised under any conditions. Footnote. Recent events, 1962, show, unfortunately, that students and intellectuals integrated in propaganda are no more armed with critical judgment than others are. What the individual loses is never easy to revive. Once personal judgment and critical faculties have disappeared or have been atrophied, they will not simply reappear when propaganda has been suppressed. In fact, we are dealing here with one of propaganda's most durable effects. Years of intellectual and spiritual education would be needed to restore such faculties. The propagandee, if deprived of one propaganda, will immediately adopt another. This will spare him the agony of finding himself vis-a-vis some event without a ready-made opinion, and obliged to judge it for himself. What does that word vis-a-vis mean? He keeps using that. I've looked this up probably 2 times. Vis-a-vis. Vis-a-vis. In relation to.
Vis-a-vis.
Vis-a-vis. Okay, this will spare him the agony of finding himself in relation to some event without a ready-made opinion and obliged to judge it for himself. And there's a footnote. This is one of the reasons why the propagandee, as soon as he is separated from his group, disintegrates morally. He needs the collective morale in order to exist. At the same time, propaganda presents facts, judgments, and values in such confusion and with so many methods that it is literally impossible for the average man to proceed with discernment. He has neither the intellectual capacity nor the sources of information. He is therefore forced either to accept or reject everything in toto. In toto? What does in toto mean? Is that in total? I'm going to assume it means in total. Why would he say in toto as a whole? Okay. We thus reach the same point via different routes. On the one hand, propaganda destroys the critical faculty. On the other, it presents objectives on which that faculty could not be exercised and thus renders it useless. All this obviously leads to the elimination of personal judgment, which takes place as soon as the individual accepts public opinion as his own. When he expresses public opinion in his words and gestures, he no longer expresses himself, but his society, his group. To be sure, the individual always will express the group, more or less. But in this case, he will express it totally and in response to a systematic operation. Moreover, this impersonal public opinion when produced by propaganda, is artificial. It corresponds to nothing authentic, yet it is precisely this artificial opinion that the individual absorbs. He is filled with it. He no longer expresses his ideas, but those of his group, and with great fervor at that. It is a propaganda prerequisite that he should assert them with firmness and conviction. He absorbs the collective judgments, the creatures of propaganda. He absorbs them like the nourishment which they have, in fact, become. He expounds them as his own. He takes a vigorous stand, begins to oppose others. He asserts himself at the very moment that he denies his own self without realizing it. When he recites his propaganda lesson and says that he is thinking for himself, when his eyes see nothing and his mouth only produces sounds previously stenciled into his brain, when he says that he is indeed expressing his judgment, then he really demonstrates that he no longer thinks at all, ever, and that he does not exist as a person. When the propagandee tries to assert himself as a living reality, he demonstrates his total alienation most clearly, for he shows that he can no longer even distinguish between himself and society. He is then perfectly integrated. He is the social group. There is nothing in him not of the group. There is no opinion in him that is not the group's opinion. He is nothing except what propaganda has taught him. He is merely a channel that ingests the truths of propaganda and dispenses them with the conviction that is the result of his absence as a person. He cannot take a single step back to look at events under such conditions. There can be no distance of any kind between him and propaganda. This mechanism of alienation generally corresponds either to projection into and identification with a hero and leader, or to a fusion with the mass. These two mechanisms are not mutually exclusive. When a Hitler Youth projected himself into his Führer, he entered by that very act into the mass integrated by propaganda. When the young Komsomol surrendered himself to the cult of Stalin's personality, he became, at that very moment, altogether part of the mass. It is important to note that when the propagandee believes that to be expressing the highest ideal of personality, he is at the lowest point of alienation. Do we not hear often enough fascism's claim that it restored personality to its place of honor? But through one channel or another, the same alienation is produced by any propaganda, for the creation of a hero is just as much the result of propaganda as is the integration of an individual in an activated mass. When propaganda makes the individual participate in a collective movement, it not only makes him share in an artificial activity, but also evokes in him a psychology of participation, a crowd psychology. This psychic modification, which automatically takes place in the presence of other participants, is systematically produced by propaganda. It is the creation of mass psychology, with man's individual psychology integrated into the crowd. In this process of alienation, the individual loses control and submits to external impulses. His personal inclinations and tastes give way to participation in the collective, but that collective will always be best idealized, patterned, and represented by the hero. The cult of the hero is the absolutely necessary complement of the massification of society. We see the automatic creation of this cult in connection with champion athletes, movie stars, and even such abstractions as Davy Crockett in the United States and Canada in 1955. This exaltation of the hero proves that one lives in a mass society. The individual who is prevented by circumstances from becoming a real person, who can no longer express himself through personal thought or action, who finds his aspirations frustrated, projects onto the hero all he would wish to be. He lives vicariously and experiences the athletic or amorous or military exploits of the god with whom he lives in spiritual symbiosis. The well-known mechanism of identifying with movie stars is almost impossible to avoid for the member of modern society who comes to admire himself in the person of the hero. There he reveals the powers of which he unconsciously dreams, projects his desires, identifies himself with his success and that adventure. The hero becomes the model and father, power and mythical realization of all that the individual cannot be. At the same time, the interests of the hero become the personal interests of the propagandee. So when they make athletes that people identify with, say Black Lives Matter, then the people that look up to those athletes are their heroes to them, get interested in Black Lives Matter, and then they can use them to brainwash people. Propaganda uses all these mechanisms, but actually does even more to reinforce, stabilize, and spread them. The propagandee is alienated and transposed into the person promoted by propaganda. Publicity campaigns for movie stars and propaganda campaigns are almost identical. For this, incidentally, no totalitarian organization is needed. Such alienation does not take place merely in the event of a Hitler or a Stalin, but also in that of a Khrushchev, a Clemenceau, a Coolidge, or a Churchill. The myth surrounding Coolidge is very remarkable in this respect. The propagandee finds himself in a psychological situation composed of the following elements. He lives vicariously through an intermediary. He feels, thinks, and acts through the hero. He is under the guardianship and protection of his living God. He accepts being a child. He ceases to defend his own interests, for he knows his hero loves him, and everything his hero decides is for the propagandee's own good. He thus compensates for the rigor of the sacrifices imposed on him. For this reason, every regime that demands a certain amount of heroism must develop this propaganda of projection onto the hero or leader. In this connection, one can really speak of alienation and of regression to an infantile state caused by propaganda. Young is of the opinion that the propagandee no longer develops intellectually, but becomes arrested in an infantile neurotic pattern. Regression sets in when the individual is submerged in mass psychology. This is confirmed by Stoetzel, who says that propaganda destroys all individuality, is capable of creating only a collective personality, and that it is an obstacle to the free development of the personality. Such extensive alienation is by no means exceptional. The reader may think we have described an extreme, almost pathological case. Unfortunately, he is a common type, even in his acute state. Everywhere we find men who pronounce as highly personal truths what they have read in the papers only an hour before, and whose beliefs are merely the result of a powerful propaganda. Everywhere we find people who have blind confidence in a political party, a general, a movie star, a country, or a cause, and who will not tolerate the slightest challenge to that God. Everywhere we meet people who, because they are filled with the consciousness of higher interests they must serve unto death, are no longer capable of making the simplest moral or intellectual distinctions, or of engaging in the most elementary reasoning. Yet all of this is acquired without effort, experience, reflection, or criticism, by the destructive shock effect of well-made propaganda. We meet this alienated man at every turn, and are possibly already one ourselves. Aside from the alienation that takes place when the rational individual retreats into the irrational collective, there are other forms of alienation. For example, through the artificial satisfaction of real needs, or the real satisfaction of artificial needs, publicity and advertising. The artificial that's funny. The artificial satisfaction of real needs, or the real satisfaction of artificial needs. That's brilliant. The first case is the one we have already discussed, in which propaganda develops from the contemporary sociological situation in order to give man artificial satisfaction for real needs. Because man is restless and frustrated, because he understands nothing of the world in which he lives and acts, because he still is asked to make very great sacrifices and efforts, because of all that, propaganda develops. Footnote. Goebbels stated expressly that propaganda should reduce frustration, artificially resolve real problems, announce the frustrations to come when one cannot avoid them, and so forth. Okay. It satisfies man, but with false and illusory satisfactions. It gives him explanations of the world in which he lives, but explanations that are mendacious and irrational. I wonder what mendacious false. Mendacious means false. Where the fuck was I? Okay. It reassures him or excites him, but always at the wrong moment. It makes him tremble with fear of some biological warfare that never did exist, and makes him believe in the peaceful intentions of countries that have no desire for peace. It gives him reasons for the sacrifices demanded of him, but not the real reasons. Thus, in 1914, it called on him to lay down his life for his country, but remained silent on the war's economic causes, for which he certainly would not have fought. Propaganda satisfies man's need for release and certainty. It eases his tensions and compensates for his frustrations, but with purely artificial means. If, for example, the worker has reasons given his actual economic situation to feel frustrated, alienated, or exploited, propaganda, which can really solve the worker's problems, as it has already done in the USSR, alienates him even more by making him oblivious of his frustration and alienation, and by calming and satisfying him. When man is subjected to the abnormal conditions of a big city or a battlefield, and has good reason to feel tense, fearful, and out of step, propaganda that adjusts him to such conditions and resolves his conflicts artificially, without changing his situation in the least, is particularly pernicious. Of course, it seems like a cure, but it is like the cure that would heal the liver of an alcoholic in such a way that he could continue to get drunk without feeling pain in his liver. Propaganda's artificial and unreal answers for modern man's psychological suffering are precisely of that kind. They allow him to continue living abnormally under the conditions in which society places him. Propaganda suppresses the warning signals that his anxieties, maladjustments, rebellions, and demands once supplied. So what's going on? Like, mental illness is a sign that you're a normal person and you can't adjust to this fucked up abnormal society. And the most severely mentally ill people are the ones who are well adjusted to a sick society. All this is also at work when propaganda liberates our deepest impulses and tendencies, such as our erotic drives, guilt feelings, and desire for power. But such liberation does not provide true and genuine satisfaction for such drives, any more than it justifies our demands and aggressions by permitting us to feel righteous in spite of them. Man can no more pick the object of his aggression than he can give free rein to his erotic drive. The satisfactions and liberations offered by propaganda are ersatz. Their aim is to provide a certain decompression, or to use the shock effect of these tremendous forces somewhere else, to use them in support of actions that would otherwise lack impetus. This shows how the propaganda process deprives the individual of his true personality. Modern man deeply craves friendship, confidence, close personal relationships. Footnote. This is what gives value and effectiveness to the technique of propaganda by personal contacts. But he is plunged into a world of competition, hostility, and anonymity. He needs to meet someone whom he can trust completely, for whom he can feel pure friendship, and to whom he can mean something in return. This is hard to find in his daily life, but apparently confidence in a leader, a hero, a movie star, or TV personality is much more satisfying. TV, for example, creates feelings of friendship, a new intimacy, and thus fully satisfies those needs. But such satisfactions are purely illusory and fallacious, because there is no true friendship of any kind between the TV personality and the viewer who feels that personality to be his friend. Here is a typical mendacious satisfaction of genuine need. And what TV spontaneously produces is systematically exploited by propaganda. The little father is always present. Another example, in 1958, Khrushchev promised the transition to integrated communism in the USSR. Later, he declared that it would be realized very soon. Based on this theme was an entire irrational propaganda campaign. Thanks for the follow, or thanks for the subscribe. What's your name? Cryptomeria? I can't believe my notifications still work. Good to know. Okay, what is this saying here? Based on the same and entire irrational propaganda campaign, whose principal argument was that communism would soon be fully attained, because by 1975 the USSR would have reached the production level of the United States, which would mean that the United States would then be ready to achieve communism. Incidentally, the year given by Khrushchev in 1958 for the occurrence of this phenomenon was 1975. But in April 1960, the year he gave was 1980. This campaign was designed to satisfy the needs of the Soviet masses, to regain their confidence and appease their demands. What we see here is a purely theoretical answer, but it satisfies because it is believed by the masses and thus made true and real by the mechanism of propaganda. Let us now look at the other side of the coin. Propaganda creates artificial needs. just as propaganda creates political problems that would never arise by themselves, but for which public opinion will then demand a solution. It arouses in us an increase of certain desires, prejudices, and needs which were by no means imperative to begin with. They become so only as a result of propaganda, which here plays the same role as advertising. Besides, propaganda is helped by advertising, which gives certain twists and orientation to individual drives, while propaganda extends the effects of advertising by promising psychological relief of tensions in general. Under the impact of propaganda, certain prejudices, certain needs become all-devouring, destructive passions occupying the entire range of a person's consciousness, superseding all other aspects of life and demanding answers. As a result of propaganda, these superficial tendencies end up by becoming identified with our deepest needs and become confused with what is most personal and profound within us. Precisely in this fashion, the genuine need for freedom has been diluted and adulterated into an abominable mixture of liberalism under the impact of various forms of propaganda of the 19th and 20th centuries. In this psychic confusion created by propaganda, propaganda alone then imposes order. Just as it is a fact that mass communication media create new needs, for example, the existence of TV creates the need to buy a set and turn it on. It is even more the case when these means are used by propaganda. And just as propaganda acts to create new needs, it also creates the demand for their solutions. We have shown how propaganda can relieve and resolve tensions. These tensions are purposely provoked by the propagandist, who holds out their remedy at the same time. He is the master of both excitation and satisfaction. One may even say that if he has provoked a particular tension, it was in order to lead the individual to accept a particular remedy, to demand some suitable action, suitable from the propagandist's viewpoint, and to submit to a system that will alleviate that tension. He thus places the individual in a universe of artificially created political needs, needs that are artificial even in their roots. He thus places the individual in a universe of artificially created political needs, needs that are artificial even if their roots were once completely genuine. For example, by creating class consciousness in the proletariat, propaganda adds a corresponding tension to the worker's misery. Similarly, by creating an equality complex, it adds another tension to all the natural demands of the have-nots. But propaganda simultaneously offers the means to reduce these tensions. It opens a door to the individual, and we have seen that it opens a door to the individual, and we have seen that is one of the most effective propaganda devices. The only trouble is that all it really offers is a profound alienation. When an individual reacts to these artificially provoked tensions, when he responds to these artificially created stimuli, or when he submits to impulses to make room for abstract drives and reduction of these tensions, he is no more himself than when he is no more himself than he is when he reacts biologically to a tranquilizer. This will appear to be a true remedy, which in fact it is, but for a sickness deliberately provoked to fit the remedy. We have frequently noted these artificial needs assume considerable importance because of their universal nature and the means, mass media, by which they are propagated. They become more demanding and imperative for the individual than his own private needs and lead him to sacrifice his private satisfactions. In politics, as in economics, the development of artificial needs progressively eliminates personal needs and inclinations. Thus, what takes place is truly an expulsion of the individual outside of himself, designed to deliver him to the abstract forces of technically orientated mechanisms. On this level, too, the more the individual is convinced that he thinks, feels, and acts on his own, the greater the alienation will be. The psychologist Biddle has demonstrated in detail that an individual subjected to propaganda behaves as though his reactions depended on his own decisions. He obeys, he trembles with fear, and expands or contracts on command. But nothing in this obedience is passive or automatic. Even when yielding to suggestion, he decides for himself and thinks himself free. In fact, the more he is subjected to propaganda, the freer he thinks he is. He is energetic and chooses his own action. In fact, propaganda to reduce the tension it has created in the first place offers him 1, 2, even 3 possible courses of action, and the propagandee considers himself a well-organized, fully aware individual when he chooses one of them. Of course, this takes little effort on his part. The propagandee does not need much energy to make his decision, for that decision corresponds with his group, with suggestion, and with sociological forces. Under the influence of propaganda, he always takes the easy way, the path of least resistance, even if it costs him his life. But even while coasting downhill, he claims he is climbing uphill and performing a personal heroic act. For propaganda has aroused his energy, personality, and sense of responsibility, or rather, their verbal images, because the forces themselves were long ago destroyed by propaganda. This duplicity is propaganda's most destructive act, and it leads us to consider next propaganda's effect of psychic disassociation. All right. Where's my bookmark? Okay. It's about a little over a half hour, and I'm going to take a break there. Probably pick it up tomorrow. Thanks for the subscriber. You're like, it's kind of shocking that anyone's actually watching me read a book, but hey, I'm reading it for me, and if other people enjoy it, that's cool. Because, I don't know. I searched YouTube for audio version of this book, and it didn't exist, so I'm just making one, like a shit version, because, I'm not professional, but